Hello and welcome to the week 5 problem solving session for the NPTEL course on environmental impact assessment. This course is being taught by Dr. Harshit Social Lakra, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Architecture and Planning at Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee. I am Isha Rathod, PMRF and Research Scholar at the Department of Architecture and Planning at IIT Roorkee. This is the Saturday week 5 problem solving session. There are sessions which happen on Tuesdays as well. So a few housekeeping rules before we go forward with the session. So please mute yourself for the session. If you have any queries or if you have any questions, you can post them in the chat box. I will keep going to the chat box throughout the session. And if you have any questions, I would ask you if you have any questions after each of the sections we have covered in this session, and then you can unmute yourself for asking your questions or uh, okay. So the outline of the session is that we are first going to look up at the highlight from this week. So we are going to look up at the key takeaways from each of the lecture units which were covered in this week. Then we will look up at assignment questions with their solutions and explanations on why those are the answers. And we will also look up at week 4 assignment problems because the deadline for the same has passed. We can now review the assignment problems and go over with the solutions for each of those questions. Lastly, if we received any queries from you throughout this week based on this week's content, we will also clarify those queries in the if we received any in the discussion forums. Okay, so week 5 looked up at connectedness, connected spaces, and subspaces, connectedness of the real line intermediate value theorem. I think this is something which has not been edited in the slide. So let's look up at the highlights from week 5. So this was lecture 21. It looked up at EIA law, policy, and institutional arrangements for EIA system. Now we are at part 9. We have looked up at different environmental parameters so far, like water, air, soil, geology, and etc. This particular module is on cultural heritage and health. So in this lecture, we looked up at cultural heritage, the international heritage conventions, treaties, and charters which have happened over the course of in a sort of timeline manner, their purpose and implications on the AIA process. So we first looked up at the cultural heritage and environmental assessment, which was defined by the World Bank in 1994. So there are four key features of this cultural heritage assessment. The first is legislation that protects types of places or particular places and sets out procedure for their protection. So, identifying and having legislation in place for cultural heritage places. Second is land management, zoning, or planning acts that provide general protection. So, if any land management or zoning or planning has to be a development project has to come near these identified places, what sort of guidelines should be provided and what sort of basically practices we should have, best practices such that the cultural heritage is not impacted by any new developments which happen. Third is acts that require the recording of data on cultural sites, example listings. So data collection and management of the identified places. And fourth is acts that protect natural areas. So one is cultural heritage, the other is natural heritage or natural areas. So these are the four key features of the cultural heritage and environmental assessment as defined by World Bank in 1994. Next, we looked up at the International Heritage Conventions, treaties, and charters, and what year they were implemented and what were the key features of each of these treaties. So, first is the Hague Convention of 1954. This is the Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict. So, it provides a system of protection of cultural property in situations of international and domestic armed conflicts. And this was agreed on by 128 state parties. So, further details you can read up in the links which have been followed. So whatever is discussed in the module in the lectures which Lakra ma'am has covered over the course, those are the only information or questions from them will only come. So if you want to learn about something more in detail, you can go to these additional links which are given in the lecture slides. 1964 was an important convention, which was the Venice Charter. So, this was the International Charter for Conservation and Restoration of Monuments and Sites. So, this set out principles for conservation and restoration of monuments and sites identified across the world. And it includes the principle of a monument setting. So, having principles on what aspects of a of the particular site needs to be conserved and restored so that the cultural heritage is not lost. 1970 is the Paris Convention, which is the convention on the means of prohibiting the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property and prevents the trade in illegally obtained cultural objects. And this has been signed by 132 parties. 1972 was the World Heritage Convention, which was the convention concerning the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage. And it established a system of collective protection of natural and cultural heritage, which is of outstanding universal value. And this has been signed by 193 parties. Moving on, 1992, we have discussed about the Convention on Biological Diversity in the module where we looked up at the biodiversity. 1994 was the ICOMOS NARA document on authenticity. This builds and extends the principles which are set out in the Venice Charter. 1999 was the ICOMOS International Cultural Tourism Charter, which aims at making the tourism more sustainable and having practices such that potential adverse effects of tourism on heritage assets and communities are being acknowledged and measures have been taken and identified for mitigating them. In 2001, we had the Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage. So, sites which are underwater, those their identification and basic principles on how to protect them. This has been signed by 56 parties. 2003, we had the Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage. So, this is for the all sorts of so there are two aspects to uh, anything which is tangible, which can be measured, and intangible, which cannot be measured directly in a quantity term. So, like emotions are intangible aspects. Uh, Knowledge systems which are being passed on from one generation to another is another intangible sort of heritage. So those kind of systems, those kind of knowledge or cultural heritage, and their safeguarding and protection, and how to map them and how to restore them. So, heritage in the form of oral traditions, perturbing arts, social practices, rituals, festive events, knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, and traditional craftsmanship knowledge and techniques. Those kind of things are identified, and their how to safeguard them is being was the main element of the 2003 Convention for Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage, and this was signed by 174 state parties. In 2008, we had the Quebec Declaration on the Preservation of the Spirit of the Place. So it aims to preserve the spirit of the place through the safeguarding of tangible and intangible heritage. So the spirit of spaces is defined as their living, social, and spiritual nature. So uh, this is what was declared in the Quebec Declaration. Okay, so this continues. Then we also had the Con guidelines. So this is voluntary guidelines for the conduct of cultural, environmental, and social impact assessments regarding developments which are proposed to take place on or which are likely to impact sacred sites and land and water traditionally occupied or used by indigenous and local communities. We also had the UNESCO CBD Joint Program on Biological and Cultural Diversity. So they identify the concept of biocultural diversity and acknowledge knowledge systems, and all of this is taken into account when developments are proposed in such a setting. So we also looked up at the definition of cultural keynote species, which was given by Garibaldi and Turner in 2004. So culturally keystone species are the culturally salient species that shape in a major way the cultural identity of a people, and their importance is reflected in the fundamental roles these species play in diet, material, medicine, and/or spiritual practices. So this cultural keystone species definition, which comes out of this module. Then, in the health aspect, we look up at the key legislation, guidance, and standards, and their implication on the EIA process. So, we looked up at the Human Health Risk Assessment, or the HHRA, given by the World Health Organization (WHO). It gives you guidelines on how to deal with chemical hazards. That is, identifying these hazards, assessing exposure, characterizing hazards, and characterizing risks, and further guidelines on how to deal with all of them. Then we also had the International Finance Corporation IFC's Performance Standard 4, which looks about community health, safety, and security. So it tries to anticipate and avoid adverse effects on the health and safety of the affected community during the proposed project uh, development and throughout the lifetime, basically. When the project is being developed, proposed to the uh, post occupancy stage. It also ensures safeguarding of personal and property is carried out in accordance with relevant human rights principles and in a manner that avoids or minimizes risks to the affected communities. So that is the IFC's performance standard fourth on community health, safety, and security. Then we also had the 2020 Corporate Sustainability Report, which looked up at different. So this is from the multinational industry corporations. They have their internal requirements for conducting a health impact assessment, or HIA. So they look up at different aspects like protecting the environment, empowering people. So in empowering people, you look up at diversity, inclusion, human rights, whether they are being breached in any way, creating prosperity, sustainable development goals. So they look up at health also in their uh, internal health impact assessments. Then we also looked up at the ICMM, on International Council on Mining and Metals, their good practice guidance on health impact assessments, and several other guidelines, guidebooks, toolkits, textbooks, and practice standards in this module. Okay, moving on to lecture 22, which was the second lecture in this week. So this looked up at law, policy, and institutional arrangements for EIA systems. This is part 10 of the same topic which we have discussed over different lectures. And this looked up at these law, policy, and institutional arrangements regarding land acquisition, resettlement, and livelihoods. So first, we looked up at key concepts and definitions regarding the terminology which is going to come. We will discuss them further. But first, let's look up at the negative impacts of resettlement. So when somebody says resettlement or land acquisition, so following negative impacts or negative bias comes into our minds. So we associate resettlement with landlessness, joblessness, homelessness, marginalization, increased morbidity, food insecurity, loss of access, and social disarticulation. These are all terms which we usually associate with land acquisition and resettlement. But when you have a project which requires land acquisition and resettlements, and you're doing a EIA for a similar kind of project, you need to transition this negative image associated with the kind of project you are doing and transition them into project outcomes which are more positive and which cater to or mitigate the sort of negative associations we have with these terminologies. So, for example, landlessness is being addressed by doing a land-based resettlement, which is if you're acquiring a land from a particular community for a particular development of your project, you are resettling them in a similar kind of context. So you're basically doing land-based resettlement. You're not just acquiring their land, but you're giving them you are resettling them also and doing ensuring that the resettlement process is smooth. So joblessness, you have to address this in terms of re-employment, whether they will get. So if it's a agriculture-based community, will they get agriculture-based? Where you are resettling them, will they have agriculture as their main um uh, practice or as their main job in this newly settled place? Homelessness, you'll help them in house construction, and your sort of compensation is going to cater to all of these aspects. Marginalization is being addressed by social inclusion. That is, if this resettlement is happening, then they are being resettled in a similar community or a similar class as from what they were moved from. You can't have, let's say, a Potter community. You have uh, moved to a city where they are finding it hard to practice because pottery also requires access to clay, soil, and all of those things. So you need to ensure that they are being socially included in their new settings. improved healthcare, adequate nutrition is being provided to them. The restoration of community assets and services is being considered in your project development and your resettlement scheme, basically. And there are networks and community rebuilding activities which you have proposed and you will oversee over the years so that they are did. Next, let's look up at key concepts and definitions which we discussed in this module. So we had the first term, which is resettlement. So it is the planned process of relocating people and communities from one place to another. Second is voluntary resettlement. This occurs when project proponents have no alternative to government expropriation or other enforced mechanisms, and people cannot be compelled to surrender their land. The opposite of voluntary resettlement is the involuntary resettlement. So resettlement is involuntary when it occurs without the informed consent of the displaced person, or if they give their consent without having the power to refuse resettlement. So in certain situations, like when you have government government projects come up, like if you have national security project, so something that deals with the which is kind of a classified project which deals with the security of the nation, the government can acquire land, giving proper compensation to, of course, the affected parties. But in that case, you don't have a choice because it's a project for the national security uh, of the country, and you have to give in the land to the government. So in that case, you cannot basically refuse resettlement. You will have to accept resettlement. So that is involuntary resettlement. Second, next definition is the eminent domain. So this is the right of a government or its agent to expropriate private property for public use with payment of compensation, of course. So this is what we were talking about. So the government has the power to take up private property for building projects for public use or for national development. But of course, they have to do this with the payment of appropriate compensation. We will look up at how compensation is being calculated and what all factors need to be considered. But that is eminent domain. Next definition is land expropriation or negotiated agreement. So this is the process whereby a public authority usually. So we just have a power cut. I think the internet is working. So land expropriation. So this is the, just give me 1 second. So land expropriation is the negotiated agreement. This is the process whereby a public authority compensation requires a person, household, or community to relinquish rights to land that it occupies or otherwise uses. Then compensation is payment in cash or in kind for an asset or a resource that is acquired or affected by a project at the time the asset needs to be replaced. Host population is the people who are living in or around areas to which people are physically displaced by a project who will be resettled and who in turn may be affected by the resettlement as well. So that is the host population. Then we have vulnerable groups. These are people who, by virtue of gender, ethnicity, age, physical or mental disability, economic disadvantage, or social status, these people may be more adversely affected by resettlement than others, and who may be limited in their ability to claim or take advantage of resettlement assistance and related development benefits. So those are vulnerable groups which are more adversely affected than other groups of people because they are sort of disadvantaged in terms of certain characteristics in their either their gender or ethnicity or all of these other parameters. So they are more adversely affected by any sort of change from the normal which they have accepted or sort of gotten used to. Then the next definition is project affected household. These are all members of a household which are whether related or not, are operating as a single economic unit who are affected by a project. Livelihood is defined as the full range of means that individuals, families, and communities utilize to make a living, such as a wage based income, agriculture, fishing, foraging, other natural resource based livelihoods like petty trade and bartering. So, whatever is the livelihood of the people, including individuals, families, and communities, altogether it can refer to livelihood. Physical displacement is the loss of shelter and assets resulting from the acquisition of land, which is associated with a project that requires the affected persons to move to another location. And economic displacement is loss of income streams or means of livelihood resulting from land acquisition or obstructed access to resources, land, water, or forest, resulting from the construction or operation of a project or its associated facilities. One is that you are being physically displaced, that is your shelter or assets where you are residing, you're being physically displaced from that location. The second is economic displacement, where your land is being your livelihood earning source, or your land, for example, of agriculture is being taken for the development of a project. So that is economic displacement. That is your livelihood means is being acquired or obtained. So that is economic displacement. So these were the key concepts definitions. Next one is the cutoff date. So this is the date of completion of the census and assets inventory of persons affected by the project. It includes persons occupying the project area after the cutoff date are not eligible for compensation and or resettlement assistance. Fixed assets such as build structures, crop fruit trees, and woodlots established after the date of completion of asset inventory or an alternative mutually agreed on date will not be compensated. So when the compensation is being calculated, there needs to be a counting of all the assets, all the people who are in a family if it's a physical displacement. So every asset needs to be counted. And if there are people who are not counted before this cutoff date, like people who are within the same household, if they are not present when this counting is happening, they will not be considered eligible for compensation or resettlement assistance. Similarly, anything which is unaccounted during the uh, compensation day. So the date uh, 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 completion of census or asset inventory happens, uh, that cutoff date or the last date by which all of these data is being collected, that is known as the cutoff date. So then we also had few international financial institutions and Equator principles, which look up at the land acquisition, the settlement and livelihood kind of consideration. So we have the IFC, or the International Finance Corporation Performance Standard 5, which looks up at land acquisition and involuntary resettlement and covers all the different aspects and how to calculate compensation and different other guidelines. We also had the World Bank Environmental and Social Framework, which again looks up at the different instruments like the resettlement plan, the resettlement action plan, the settlement framework, the process framework, and all of those things. Then we also looked up at the Equator principles. So these are principles which were intended to serve as a common baseline and risk management framework for financial institutes to identify, assess, and manage the environmental and social risks when financing projects. So the Equator principles apply globally to all industry sectors and to 5 financial products. So these 5 financial products are project finance advisory services, project finance, project-related corporate loans, bridge loans, and project-related refinance and project-related acquisition finance. So this last one looks up at acquisition finance and acquisition frameworks, resettlement action plans, RAP, all of those kind of things. Okay. So these are they provide a sustainability framework for global finance industry. 127 financial institutes in 38 countries have officially adopted the Equator principles. You can read about them more. And the International Finance Corporation standards are applied in EIA for development projects. So different statement purposes, which can be uh, these principles are basically mentioned, so you can read about them as well. So the resettlement framework and resettlement action plan were also discussed. So the key objective of the resettlement best practice resettlement as identified is to avoid And when avoidance is not possible, minimize the displacement by exploring alternative project designs to avoid forced eviction, to anticipate and avoid, or where avoidance is not possible, minimize the adverse social and economic impacts from land acquisition or restrictions on land use. This is by providing compensation for the loss of assets at the replacement cost, or ensuring that the resettlement activities which are implemented, they are implemented with appropriate disclosure of information, consultation by the parties who are being affected, and the informed participations of those who are affected. It Another aspect is to improve and restore the livelihoods and standards of living of the displaced people, such that no negative feelings are associated, and later on there's no legal procedure which is happening, which will affect the project deadline or the project timeline. Another key feature of a good resettlement is to improve the living conditions among the physically displaced persons through the provision of adequate housing with security of tenure at resettlement sites. So, physically displaced people, meaning your vulnerable population, is also being their living standards and conditions are being met uh, because they are the most adversely affected. So, these are key objectives of a good or a best practice resettlement. Which needs to be considered. We discuss local procurement, which refers to the purchase of goods and services from local businesses. This is to ensure that uh, local procurement acts in the favor as a strategic business tool by international companies in the industry. This is because when a project is being proposed in the site, you also say that because of this development of this project, we are going to use the local goods or the local services, local labor. So they will get jobs and they will sort of have some sort of benefit coming out of it directly. So this is another investment or a strategic tool which is used in resettlement. Uh, as per the International Finance Corporation Principle 5, which looks up at the resettlement, certain documents need to be prepared. So these are the Resettlement Action Plan or the RAP, the Livelihood Restoration Framework, and the Livelihood Restoration Plan. So three documents need to be prepared. We also need to do a social impact assessment for the project, which looks up at the people well-being in terms of how the community values being maintained, how the cultural values being maintained, how livelihoods are being addressed, and how they are similar to the kind of project which is happening. The infrastructures being maintained, housing, environment, land, and all of these together, and the different linkages between all of these key areas are being considered in the social impact assessment. Uh, so the moving on to the next module. So now this looks up at land acquisition again, but in the Indian context. So we first look up at the right to property. So the right to property is not a fundamental right. We have certain fundamental rights which are mentioned in the Constitution of India, but the right to property is not a fundamental right. That is, you are not entitled to owning a property in India, but this is a constitutional right under the Article 300A of Constitution that you can own the property by paying a certain amount, and that lease is valid for a certain period of time. But this property can be acquired for example, the government can acquire a property for the development project, which is for national security or for building up roads or for development of infrastructure. So anything which is for national or public use development, the government can acquire this. So you don't have a fundamental right to property and you cannot challenge that. You would have to involuntarily, uh, uh, you would have to like agree to it, and you cannot press claims for this kind of situation. But we have the right to fair compensation and transparency in land acquisition. So this is the Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act, which was passed in 2013. So this is a humane, participative, informed, and transparent process. So it is done so that least disturbance is faced by the owners of the land and other affected families, and it provides just and fair compensation for your land which is being acquired for whatever project. And it has provisions for affected persons for their rehabilitation and resettlement. And the affected persons become partners in development because of this act, because at different points, their opinions and their feedbacks being considered in the consultation practices which happen. So they become partners in the development of the project. So, for the application of the Act, there are this Act concerns land acquisition, compensation, rehabilitation, and resettlement. These are the four key applications of how the Act proceeds. So, for land acquisition, you can have different type of projects. So, the first type A is the for strategic purposes relating to naval, military, air force, and the armed forces of the Union, including the central paramilitary forces or any work vital to national security or defense of India or state police, safety of the people. So this is the first category of projects which can claim uh, land acquisition. The second is for infrastructure projects. So this include all activities or items listed in the notification of the Government of India and the Department of Economic Affairs, infrastructure section, excluding private hospitals, private educational institutions, and private hotels. Second is projects involving agro-processing. Third, projects for industrial corridors or mining activities, national investment and manufacturing zones as designated in National Manufacturing Policy. Fourth is the project for government-administered, government-aided educational and research schemes or institutions. Fifth, project for sports, healthcare, tourism, transportation, or space program. And lastly, any infrastructure facility as may be notified in this regard by the central government and after tabling of such notification in Parliament. So the first one was towards the defense or towards the security of the country. Second one is for infrastructure projects, which are for public use, for the development of the country or for the increase in GDP of the country. So the second type is infrastructure projects relating to the development for of the country. Then it can be projects for project affected families. Uh, Fourth can be projects for housing for specific income groups. You have low income group housings or the uh, those kind of projects for building up those kind of housing projects for them. Uh, Fifth is planning project for planned development or improvement of village sites or any site in the urban area or provision of land for residential purposes for the weaker sections in rural and urban areas. You can also acquire land for projects for residential purposes to the poor or landless, or to persons residing in areas who are affected by natural calamities, or to persons displaced or affected by reason of implementation of any scheme undertaken by the government, any local authority or the corporation which is owned or controlled by the government. So these are the cases in which land acquisition can happen. So a land acquisition can basically be divided into two type of projects. So one is for public-private partnership projects, and the second is for private companies for public purpose. So in a public-private partnership, what happens is the government basically, so this is the PPP model. So the government basically floats a tender for the development of a public use facility, but that facility, because the government has to pay a certain amount for the development of that property, and it usually does not want to invest or give in that much of money without any results being shown. So they give this project to a private company based on a tender and their certain document verifications and things. So that private company comes in and builds this entire infrastructure. Of course, the government pays certain amount to it, but it gives a clause where the private company can run. So, for example, your tolls, which you see when you cross different borders or when you travel from one place to another, you would have seen a toll booth or something. So, those kind of projects are being developed by in the PPP model. So, in that sense, the private company will run that toll booth for a certain amount of years, and whatever profits it generates out of running it for, let's say, 15 years, it will take those profits as their compensation or as their payment, and then after 15 years, it will return that toll booth back to the government, and then the government can run it further for those number of years. So that is how the PPP development occurs. So the government does not give in a lot of money for the development, but that infrastructure is being developed and maintained by the private entity or a company for a certain time period, and it gets the revenues or the cost out of it from for running it up for a certain number of years. So there's different models under which PPP happens. You can read about it if you find this interesting. And then the second type is for private companies for public purpose. So for private companies, when they come in and uh, they want to build infrastructure, so they can build this kind of infrastructure for public purpose. So those two kind of projects are broadly categories in which land acquisition is acquired. So for obtaining consent, they should do a social impact assessment study, which is referred. So in these cases, you have to have certain clauses which needs to be met. So the social impact assessment study, it should include the public purpose for which this land acquisition is being undertaken. So these are the public purposes we have looked up previously, uh, like defense and infrastructure for social use and things like that. So they need to write their public purpose. They need to estimate the families which are going to be affected by it, the number of families who are likely to be displaced because of this land acquisition. They also need to estimate the extent of land, the public and private houses, settlement, and other common properties which are going to be affected because of their land acquisition. They need to ensure the bare minimum extent of land for acquisition. They need to give this boundary or the area which they're going to acquire. They also need to provide they need to basically review all alternatives before suggesting that land acquisition is the last resort or this is the only thing which can, uh, like they have come to land acquisition as the last resort, and all of the other strategies which can be used are not viable or not feasible. So they need to ensure that all alternatives are being reviewed and the last resort is the land acquisition. And lastly, they have also have to study the social impacts of the project, the nature and cost of addressing them, and the cost benefit analysis. So they need to include all of this in the social impact assessment study. And then the public hearing of the social impact assessment study is going to be undertaken at the affected areas to get to know the views of the affected families so that they are being recorded and they are included in the social impact assessment report. And the publication of the social impact assessment study report also needs to be done in the local language to the and to be sent to the panchayat, municipality, or the municipal corporation where this uh, affected families or communities live, so that their views and their um feedback is also being recorded and they are sort of aware about this kind of project is going to be undertaken. So they are aware about it. So they also need to ensure a safeguard for food security. So if the so this act basically specifies that no irrigated multi-crop land shall be acquired under this act, and only in exceptional circumstances can an agriculture-based land be acquired. And if they are acquiring an agriculture-based land, they need to give equivalent area of cultivable land, uh, equivalent value of land acquired, or the equivalent land uh, as a sort of compensation. And acquisition of agricultural land in aggregate for all projects in the district or state shall in no case exceeds the limit which are set out for the total net sown area of that district or state. And certain exceptions are, of course, considered, which are for the development of linear projects. So these are projects like your railways, highways, major district roads, irrigation canals, and power lines. So these examples are basically considered because your railway line or your highway line, they can't basically cut. They have to basically cut through. Uh, they might cut through a land because they are linear projects. So those are the only exceptions. They can't go around your land and try to protect it. So these are the exceptions which are considered, but then equivalent compensation is being considered. Okay. Then in the Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act, we have so so the scheme considers all of the features. So we will look up at the features now. So the collector, the administrator is required to conduct a survey and undertake a census of the affected families. So it needs to include in the survey all the particulars for land and immovable properties which are being inquired. of each affected family and for the purpose of rehabilitation and resettlement. They also need to record the livelihood lost in respect of the land losers or the land or the people whose livelihood are dependent on these land. They also need to list public utilities and government buildings which are going to be affected or likely to be affected when they are considering the resettlement of the affected families as well. They need to detail out the amenities and infrastructure facilities which are going to be affected, and they need to give details for any common property resources which are being acquired. So your Gram Sabha or your those kind of common property resources, if they are being storage facilities, they are being acquired. So they need to list that as well. Then they need to draft the rehabilitation and resettlement scheme draft they need to prepare. So they need to have a time limit for implementing the rehabilitation and resettlement scheme. They need to do wide publicity in the affected area that there's going to be a rehabilitation and resettlement activities is going to happen. There's going to be surveys, and they need to discuss this with the concerned Gram Sabha municipalities or municipal corporations, how to move further. Then a public hearing will be conducted in the prescribed manner as agreed by Gram Sabha municipalities or the municipal corporation. Any claims and objections will be raised in public, and they will be recorded. And then, after all of this, the social impact assessment report will be prepared. It will be reviewed for the rehabilitation and resettlement scheme. Its publication will be sent to the panchayat, municipal corporation, municipality in their local language. Publication of declaration and summary of the scheme will be given with the compensation which is being allotted to the families, the time period for which this will happen. All of these details will be made available. Again, wide publicity of all of this will be done in the affected area. The award shall be made within a period of 12 months from the date of publication of the declaration. And if no award is made within the period, the entire proceedings for the acquisition of the land shall relapse. So if this period of 12 months from the date of publication or declaration, if this is not being met, this deadline is not met, then the entire land acquisition process will basically be for nothing. And if they want to acquire it again, if they have not met this, they have to go through this entire process again. So after a period of 12 months, it basically relapses. You have to redo the process again if it has not been completed. Of course, there are certain loopholes which can be found and things like that, but this is the official guideline. Then the determination of market value of land by the collector will be done, and the determination of the amount of compensation. So for compensation, these are the parameters which are considered. So there's the market value, the current market value when this has been calculated of the land. The damages which are sustained by the interested or the person who's affected, and by reason of the taking of any standing crops, trees which may be on the land at the time. So the taking possession of those will also be considered. Then damages sustained by the person by reason of severing such land from his other land. So if it's a connected land, if it's a, let's say, a larger property and a part of that property is being taken by the taken for the project development, then what sort of damage that person is facing, that will also be accounted. Then damage sustained by that person because of uh, okay, yeah, because of by reason of acquisition injuriously affecting his other property, movable or immovable in any other manner, or his earnings, compelled to change his residence or place of business, reasonable expenses incidental to such changes, decrease of the property of the land, and any affected ground which may be in interest of equity, justice, and beneficial to the affected families. So these are the few considerations which are considered in the calculation for compensation. So those are few characteristics. Then we looked up at special provisions for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, the SC and ST community. So as far as possible, no acquisition of land shall be made in the scheduled areas. If it should be done only if it is the last resort. Prior consent of the concerned Gram Sabha or Panchayat needs to be taken. And in case of involuntary displacement, a development plan shall be prepared, laying out the details of the procedure for settling the land rights or giving them a special drive-through with the land acquisition. And the development plan shall contain a program for development of alternate fuel for the non-timber forest produce resources on non-forest lands within a period of 5 years, sufficient to meet the requirements of the tribal communities as well as the scheduled castes. So they need to ensure all of these. And again, if the land is being acquired by members of scheduled castes or scheduled tribes, at least one third of the compensation amount shall be paid upfront, initially as the first installment, and the rest can be paid after the possession of the land, such that they have a easy time settling in because these are vulnerable groups, vulnerable communities. So they need to be paid in this amount prior to their resettlement, one third at least, so that they can settle in and have a sort of easier smoothing process. Also, the affected families of scheduled tribes shall be resettled, preferably in the same scheduled area in a compact block, so that they can retain their ethnic, linguistic, and cultural identity, such that they are socially not being isolated because of this resettlement. And the resettlement areas predominantly inhabited by the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes shall get land to such extent as may be decided by the appropriate government, free of cost for community and social gatherings, so that they can keep their social networks together and have their transfer of knowledge and things. And if any tribal land is also being considered or land belonging to scheduled castes in this, so they should be given. Uh, Yeah, so basically, similar things apply to tribal communities as well, scheduled caste and tribal communities. And lastly, if the affected scheduled tribe depend on uh, traditional methods of forest, they are forest based or they have fishing rights. They use like a local pond for their meeting their personal needs. Then fishing rights in the river or pond shall be given. So, for example, if a dam development is happening and this community was previously using the water body for fishing, then they should also be given the fishing rights to the river or pond or dam uh, further, so that they are being met. So they have the right to fishing rights basically, or forest rights. And if they are relocated outside of the district, then they shall be paid an additional 25% for the rehabilitation and resettlement benefits. That is, if their district is also being changed, then additional amount of money will be paid to them. So this is again so that vulnerable communities are more adversely affected because of any change which is happening, and they are not very economically dependent uh, on other means. So their interests are being considered by the government in rehabilitation and resettlement. So these are few considerations, more considerations. So the key features of the Resettlement and Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act. So we had different type of public purpose projects. Private prior consent needs to be taken for these public-private partnership projects, and these includes consent to the amount of compensation that will be paid. The payment of compensation is calculated based on certain parameters. There is the link between the Land Acquisition Act and the accompanying obligations for resettlement and rehabilitations. We also need to consider the return of unutilized land. That is, if that 12-month period is not being met, then the land acquisition is basically null and void. The increase in share of the acquired land, the income tax exemption is there. Acquisition is the last resort. It is only if necessary. Strict restrictions on multi-crop acquisition or agriculture-based land. Certain share in developed land, fishing rights to scheduled caste or scheduled tribe communities who are dependent on the water body or forest, and social impact assessment is being conducted and reviewed by expert groups. So these are the key features which we discussed from the India perspective. Then we also looked up at, so this is another lecture, lecture 24, where we looked up at EIA, law, policy, and institutional arrangements for EIA system, part 12. So this looks up at social economic impact assessment and resource efficiency. So here we look up at social impacts, international guidance and standards. So we have certain international guidance and standards. So first, the social impacts are changes to one or more of the following. So these can be changes to the people's way of living or their lifestyle, livelihood, their culture, their community, political systems or beliefs, environment, health and well-being, and personal and property rights. So these are the social impacts which are considered when we do socioeconomic impact assessment. And certain agencies or the, let's say, organizations which are interested in the social impact assessment. So these are the United Nations Human Rights Council, UNHRC, the Human Rights Impact Assessment, HRIA, the World Bank, UN Environment, which is the UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, and the International Finance Corporation, IFC. So the IFCs has two standards which look up at risk management and labor. So it looks up at risk, environmental and social impact risk management of projects, the performance standard one, and it looks up at community engagement and consultation with local communities who are being affected by the development of the project. And it gives the clients management of environmental and social performance throughout the life of the project. Standard 2 looks up at fair treatment and non-discrimination of labor forces which are being involved in the development of the project. It ensures good worker management relationships. So it gives guidelines on how to do all of these. It gives compliance with relevant employment and labor laws. It provides workers protection, especially vulnerable groups such as children, um, and safe and healthy working conditions and no use of forced labor. So it has guidelines regarding labor and their well-being. And the first one is towards risk management. Then we also had the International Association for Impact Assessment guidelines on assessing and managing social impacts of projects. So it has a few guidelines like the social license to operate, which is the level of acceptance or approval of the activities of an organization by its stakeholders, especially if they are locally impacted communities. Then they have the free, prior, and informed consent, which is the mechanism developed to assist in ensuring the right of indigenous people to self-determination. We have human right due diligence, that is, human rights are being met, and non-technical risks, which is the managerial, legal, social, and political issues which are being faced by a project, in contrast to the technical risks, which are in the development or construction of the project, if those kind of risks. So this is the IAIA's guidance on social assessing and managing social impact assessments. Uh, so basically, it covers all of these different concepts, impacts and benefits agreements, sustainable livelihoods, shared value. So shared values that both the society as well as company, they have the shared value rather than just profit for its stakeholders. So they also look up at social benefits apart from profit. Okay, we looked up at this. Then we also have this module also covers resource efficiency. So for resource efficiency, the IFC's standard 3 looks up at resource efficiency and pollution prevention. And other resources include the UNEP's annual reports, the NEPA process, the European EIA directive. The last module, we look up at the EIA law, policy, and institutional arrangements for EIA systems. And this is part 13, where we look up at transport, landscape, and visual aspects for the project. So we have for transport, we look up at policy and guidance on EIA for transport projects. So first we have the World Bank guideline of 1997, which was a handbook on roads and the environment. So it integrates road planning and management with environmental thinking and improves this communication and interests of these different groups, which is the infrastructure development and the environmental thinkers. So it brings different concepts and terminologies together. This is the first sort of document which emphasized and improved this awareness or thinking of infrastructure and road infrastructure and environmental management. So we have 5 types of AIAs which apply to road projects. So first is project-specific AIA, which assesses individual new roads or public transport infrastructure. So for that particular project, you do AIA. Second is programmatic AIA. So this examines a number of individual projects that may be delivered together as a package or program. So if it's a larger, let's say a metro development project, so you will have different metro lines which are coming up. So this is a kind of programmatic EIA where you have individual projects, but they are all clubbed together or delivered as a single unit. Next, we have summary environmental evaluation. So this is focusing on specific categories of impact and their mitigation. So if they target a particular category, or AI is required for the particular category itself, then this kind of AIA is done. Then there's regional EIA, which examines all the planned projects within a specified geographical area at the subnational level, so region-specific EIA, and sectoral EIA. So strategically assessing all projects of a certain type, such as transport infrastructure in a relatively large geographical area. So these are region-based, the last two. Okay. Then we have certain guidelines like the European Investment Bank's guidelines on the appraisal of investment projects. So it calculates the economic returns of the project using internationally accepted methods, and it does a socioeconomic cost analysis for these kind of projects. Then for Indian guidance, we have the guidance for environmental impact assessment of highway projects. We looked up at this in the transport module as well. And we also have the environment impact assessment guideline manuals for the, highways 2010. We looked up at the sort of code of practice for highway projects. What are the manuals which are available? What are the Indian standards, safety, pedestrian for guidelines for pedestrian facilities, guidelines for road construction zones, and all of those things. So these are different guidelines. Then we also have international good practices. So these are basically technical documents which give you policies, uh, a collection of good practices. And they can be grouped into three categories, which is planning and design, construction management aspects, and management of sensitive the sectors. So we will read about them further also in more detail. Then we have the Indian Guidance Document on Green National Highway Corridor Project. So this is 2019. And there, so it provides environmental management framework to deal with environmental issues during planning, design, and constructions of roads under the project. We have the International Botswana Guidelines, which looks up at the impact assessment again for road infrastructure. So it looks at planning an EIA of road infrastructure, and the objective is to provide a comprehensive technical basis for decision making, so that implementing EIA in the planning process for road development. Then we have policies to reduce the transport impact and improve accessibility. So transport statement or transport assessment allows to consider the opportunities for sustainable transport modes, uh, to reduce the need for new major transport infrastructure, have safe and suitable access to site can be achieved by people of all kinds. Improvements can be undertaken within the transport network that cost effectively limit the significant impacts of the development. We also have measures around the management planning, so mixing and clubbing the land use. Then for landscape and visual, we have certain legislations like the US National Park Service Organic Act, the UK's National Park and Access to Countryside Act, the New Zealand's NPA, European Landscape Convention of or the Florence Convention. So these are certain legislations. You can read about them from the module. Then we had certain guidances which are available for visual impact assessment and visual resource management. So these are again by different agencies at different points of times. We have guidance on visual uh, landscape and visual impact assessment in the UK, relatively detailed guidelines for them. Guidelines for doing visual simulations and preparing these kind of documents. Uh, We also have landscape in the IFC's standards. So performance standard 6 looks up at biodiversity. It also considers aspects of landscape planning. And then certain other guidelines relating to roads as well. Okay. And relating to the renewable energy. Okay. So this was all which we discussed. Okay, so we have a hand raise. So this was all we discussed in this week's content. If anybody has any questions, you can just unmute yourself or you can put it in the chat box. I see somebody has their hand raised. You can just unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay. Do you have a question? Mug, Mug is, okay, I can't see the full name. Okay. So if nobody has any questions, I just once check if, okay, I think, okay. Okay. Okay, so we have, so I don't know if the landscape and visual guidelines are considered in India projects as of yet. There was a project for the development of the airport, I think, in Pondicherry, for which EIA was done and these considerations were done. We look up at this in a further module. We look up at that case study examples directly in a lecture unit further down the course, where we look up at project specific examples of what all was considered in the report. We have two case studies which were considered. So we will look up at project examples. As far as I know, I've not seen the visual impact assessment for the Indian projects, but I will also check if we consider these guidelines for projects in India as of yet. But don't worry, we will look up at project specific examples. There are, I think, two lecture units or one lecture unit which consider case examples, and it considers that entire report which is being generated in EIA and the different sections based on whatever we have discussed so far under each head, whatever was considered and prepared in that report. I can, I think, share that report in the folder in which I will share these slides. So you can probably refer to that uh, example case study. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. So if nobody has any other questions, we can move on to question and answers. So I will put the question on the screen, and you can either you can put your answers in the chat box. I will regulate the chat box. Okay, so the first question is the quick on guidelines deal with A, cultural, environment, and social impact assessment, B, language impact assessment, C, economic impact assessment, or D, all of the above. Okay, so we have an answer D. We have another answer. Okay. So the Aquicon guidelines, these are voluntary guidelines. These are for the conduct of culture, environment, and social impact assessment, which are taken regarding developments which are proposed to take place or which are likely to take place near sacred sites or on lands and areas which are identified as traditionally occupied by indigenous and local communities. So they give you guidelines on cultural, environmental, and social impact assessment. So A is the correct answer. Okay. Moving on to next question, state true or false. Garibaldi and Turner in 2004 proposed the concept of cultural keystone species. So is this statement true or false? So we have another answer A. Okay, so this statement is true. So Garibaldi and Turner in 2004, they defined the concept of cultural keynote species. So these are species who are culturally salient species that shape in a major way the cultural identity of a of a people or a community, and their importance is reflected in the fundamental roles these species play in diet, materials, medicine, and or spiritual practices. So, for examples, if you would have heard of Mahdouds, or people who basically have use elephants, or have the like places, certain places have uh, key species, like these species have they shape the cultural identity of the people. So for example, your elephant trainers, I'm not remembering the correct word for them, but there are villages or communities which train and are dependent on uh, the species of elephants. You have them in Rajasthan, also one particular village, and you have people in Kerala also who have that identity associated with them. Okay, so these are cultural keystone species. Okay, moving on to the next question. So the human health risk assessment, or the HHRA, is related with human exposure to chemical contaminants. Is this statement true or false? So we have another, you have one answer A. Okay, another A. Okay, so this statement is true. So the WHO's Human Health Risk Assessment Toolkit, which is the HHRA, it deals with exposure to chemical contaminants, deals with chemical hazards. So identifying those hazards, assessing the exposure, characterizing the hazards, and characterizing risks. So it deals with chemical contaminants. So this statement is true. Okay, so moving on to the next question. Which of the following lending institutions require health effects assessment? First, International Finance Corporation, IFC. Second, African Development Bank. Third, Asia Development Bank. And fourth, Inter-American Development Bank. So which of these institutions require the health impact or the health effect assessment? So projects which need or which take funding from these institutions for development activities, do they require to do a health impact assessment? Okay, we have one answer D. So for getting funding from these institutions, you need to do an HIA. So these institutions are D, all of the above. So all of these institutions require that a health impact assessment is being done for the proposed project for which they are seeking the funding or taking financial resources from them. So all of the four require a health impact assessment. So D is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question. So match the terms given in Group A with their description in Group B. So in Group A, we have the terms, and in Group B, we have their definitions or descriptions. So these are terms relating to the rehabilitation and resettlement scheme. So you need to match each term with their description. Okay, we have one answer. Okay, so we have eminent domain, which is the right of the government or its agent to expropriate private property for public use with the payment of compensation. That is, the government is the eminent domain. They have the right to take any private property for any public use development activity with paying compensation, of course. So P matches with 4. Then economic displacement is if there's a loss of income streams or means of livelihood resulting from land acquisition or obstructed access to resources like land, water, or forests resulting from the construction or operation of a project or its associated facilities. So if the people are being their livelihood or their income source is being affected because of a land acquisition or rehabilitation scheme, then they are being economically displaced. That is the economic uh, flow is being disrupted because of this land acquisition. So that is economic displacement. So Q matches with 1, whereas your physical displacement is when your shelter is being acquired, or the land on which your shelter is being developed, when that is being acquired, that is physical displacement. So Q matches with 1. Then compensation is any payment in cash or in kind for an asset or a resource that is acquired or affected by a project at the time the asset needs to be replaced. So R matches with 2. So, and then the host population is the population or the people living in or around areas to which people are physically displaced by a project will be resettled, and who in turn will may be affected by the resettlement. So S matches with 3. So D, that is P matches with 4, Q matches with 1, R matches with 2, and S matches with 3 is the correct answer. So again, definitions and the meaning of the terms, if you can just understand them and later maybe not remember the entire definition, but understand the meaning out of it, you can better answer them in the examination, because of course you have a lot of definitions which will come up in this course. So maybe just understanding them and then recalling them will help you in the examination. Okay, moving on to the next question. So state true or false. Cutoff date is the date of completion of the census and asset inventory of persons affected by the project. So is the statement true or false? Again, a definition based question. Okay, so we have an answer A. Okay, another A. Okay, so the statement is true. So the cutoff date is the date of completion of the census and assets inventory of the persons affected by a project. And if by that date, by that date, if these people who are occupying the project area, they are not being um, registered, or they are not being marked in the inventory, then they will not be paid the compensation. Similarly, with the assets, if they are not being registered or they are not being no claims have been made by the cutoff date, then they will not be compensated. So that is the cutoff date. So this statement is true. Moving on to the next question. So state true or false again. As per the IFC Principle 5, land acquisition and involuntary resettlement, the resettlement framework is required to be prepared. So is the statement true or false? Okay, we have answers A coming in. Okay. So the statement is true. As per the International Finance Corporation, which is a funding agency, their Principle 5, the settlement framework, land acquisition and voluntary resettlement, documents which need to be prepared are the Settlement Action Plan, RAP, Livelihood Restoration Framework, and Livelihood Restoration Plan. All of these three documents are together known as the resettlement framework. So this resettlement framework needs to be prepared and submitted to them for the funding to process. So this statement is true. Okay, moving on to the next question. So state true or false, right to property is a fundamental right in India. Is this statement true or false? Okay, we have an answer A. We have a contradicting answer B. I've emphasized this in our revision as well. Okay, we have another answer B. Okay, so B is the correct answer. Right to property is not a fundamental right in India. So, fundamental right is like your right to speech, right to freedom. Those are your fundamental rights. Whereas right to property is not a fundamental right, but it is a constitutional right which is given to you under the Article 300A of the Constitution. So, any person who's born will not have like you are not entitled a property just because you are a citizen of India, but you need to acquire or pay certain compensation for owning that property for a certain lease period, and that can be renewed, of course, but it can this property can be acquired by the government also for the development of public use. So it's not a fundamental right, but it is a constitutional right. So the statement given was false. Okay, so B is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question. The right to fair compensation and transparency in land acquisition, rehabilitation, and resettlement Act of 2003 makes provision for A. Social impact assessment, B. Climatic impact assessment, C. Biophysical impact assessment, and D. Health impact assessment. Okay, we have an answer A. We have another A. Okay, so A is the correct answer. So a social impact assessment studies being undertaken when we talk about the right to fair compensation and transparency in land acquisition, rehabilitation, resettlement act. So this social impact assessment will review the public purpose for which the land acquisition is occurring, whether it's for defense of the country or for infrastructure projects for public use or for the housing for uh, economically backward communities like that. So you review the public purpose, then you estimate how many families or communities, number of families are going to be affected or displaced, whether houses or the private property, public property, other common properties, how many number are being affected, minimum extent of land which will be acquired, and if this was the last resort, that is land acquisition was the last resort and all the other alternatives have been reviewed, needs to also be mentioned in this assessment study. And then any other social impacts of the project, which are going to be uh, occurring because of this development activity, and their cost benefit analysis needs to be done. So this particular act makes provisions for social impact assessment. So A is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question. The Right to Fair Compensation and Transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act 2013 make provisions for the following. First, prior consent. Two, payment of compensations. Three, return of unutilized land, or for all of the above. Which of these provisions does this act make or allow for? Okay, so we have one answer, which is D. Okay, so D is the correct answer. So you need prior consent required for public-private partnership projects, and you need to specify the kind of project which is going to be undertaken. Then you need to do payment of compensation to the affected parties based on the calculation or compensation parameters which we looked up. Then any unutilized land, whether it is not being utilized in the project or whether uh, the compensation has not been paid out within the specified time period of 12 months, then the land needs to be returned. So all four of them actually needs are considerations which are being undertaken. So this question is slightly kind of skewed. That fourth is not an option, but all of the above. So if this kind of question comes in the exam, you can basically ask for grace marks or something because this is kind of a skewed question. So these are questions from the previous course run. Nobody raised an objection to revise it, so this is what has been running. Moving on to the next question. So the IFC performance standards of particular relevance to socioeconomic assessment, impact assessment include A, Principle 1, Assessment and Management of Environment and Social Risks and Impact. B, Performance Standard 2, Labor and Working Conditions. C, Performance Standard 7, Indigenous People. Or D, all of the above. So which of the International Finance Corporation standards are of particular importance or relevance to socioeconomic impact assessments? So we have one answer A and another D. Okay, we have another D. So D is the correct answer because performance standard 1 deals with the risk management of the communities. Second is the labor and the well-being of labor forces and their well-being. And 7 is for indigenous people who are the most vulnerable group of people who will be affected by the development of a project. So all three of them look up at the socioeconomic impacts on and their assessment. So 1, 2, and 7 are the three principal standards of the IFC which deal with socioeconomic impact assessments. Okay, so D is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question. So match the terms given in Group A with their description in Group B. So in Group A, you have certain terms, and in Group B, you have their description. So these are from the guidelines. If you understand the basic meaning of the term, you can sort of have an inkling towards what that particular guideline means. So A. Okay. So social license to operate is the procedural mechanism which is developed to assist in ensuring the right of indigenous people to self-determination. So P matches with 1. Then free, prior, and informed consent, or the FPIC, is the level of acceptance or approval of activities of an organization by its stakeholders, especially local impacted communities. So Q matches with 3. And R, which is social risk, it looks about the possibility that the intervention would create, reinforce, or deepen inequity, and/or social conflict, or that the attitudes and actions of key stakeholders may subvert the achievement of the development objective, or that the development objective or means to achieve it lack ownership among the key stakeholders. So there's a social risk associated with that intervention. So R matches with 2. All terms which were the key concepts which were discussed in the International Association for Impact Assessment, or IAIA, guidance for assessing and managing the social impacts of project. So of course, key concepts from these documents are also important. So the option B, that is P matches with 1, Q matches with 3, and R matches with 2 is the correct answer. Okay. So moving on to the next question. So a state true or false. Non-technical risks relate to the managerial, legal, social, and political issues which are faced by a project. So is the statement true or false? Again, this was a key concept which was mentioned, the non-technical risks. So this was a key concept which was mentioned in the IA's social impact assessment guidance. So we have an answer B. Okay, so this statement is true. This was non-technical risks are basically uh, the managerial, legal, social, and political issues which a project face in contrast to technical risks which it might face, which are so technical risks include your construction delays or materials not being meeting the deadline or coming on time. Uh, the management plan, development management plan facing time issues or certain failures of structural members and things like that. So those are your technical skills based on your project side of it. But your non-technical risks are risks which are related to management, legal, social, and political issues which can arise throughout your project lifespan. So again, a key concept which was mentioned in the IAI is social impact assessment guidance. So A, true is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question. Match the EIA typologies as given by the World Bank Guide of 1997 for road projects of Group A with description in Group B. So in Group A, we have the type of EIA which is being done for road projects, and in Group B, we have the definition for which that EIA is being done. We looked up at them in the revision or review of the key concepts as well. Okay, we have one answer. Okay, so project-specific EIA is assessing individual new roads or public transport infrastructure. So one particular project or one particular road is being considered. So individual being the key term here. So P matches with two. Then programmatic EIA deals with examining a number of individual projects that may be delivered together as a package or program. So for example, your metro project, which can have different metro lines, which are by itself individual projects, but they are being considered together in that bundle or package of the metro project. So Q matches with one. Then we have the sectoral AIA, which is strategically assessing all projects of a certain type, such as transport infrastructure in a relatively large geographical area. So R matches with 4. And then regional AIA is examining all the planned project within a specific geographical area at the subnational level. So S matches with 3. So the option A, that is P matches with 2, Q matches with 1, R matches with 4, and S matches with 3 is the correct answer. So again, terminologies and descriptions. Okay, moving on to the next question. So state true or false. Indian government provides environmental impact assessment guidance manual for highways. Is the statement true or false? Okay, so we have one answer. Okay, so the statement is true. We have certain Indian guidance for impact assessment for highway projects. So this includes your guidelines for environmental impact assessment of highway projects of 1989 and the environmental impact assessment guidance manual for highways 2010. So both of these guidance are your guidance for EIA for highways. So the statement is true. Moving on to the next question. So in UK web tag guidance, the full form of tag is A, Transport Advisory Group, B, Transport Analysis Guidance, C, Technical Analysis Guidance, or D, Technology Advisory Group. Okay, so we have one answer. Okay, so the correct answer is Transport Analysis Guidance. TAG basically stands for Transport Analysis Guidance. This is web tag, which is the UK's Department for Transport Analysis Guidance. So TAG stands for Transport Analysis Guidance. So B is the correct answer. Okay, so moving on. So match the terms given in Group A with their transition project outcomes in Group B. So in Group A, we have the negative terminology, which is related to rehabilitation, land acquisition and rehabilitation process. And in Group B are the transition project outcomes which can be undertaken to show that the land acquisition and resettlement is being moved towards a positive connotation. We discussed this before beginning the resettlement lecture unit. Okay, so the negative impacts which are mentioned is the increased morbidity. So it can be changed, transitioned in project outcomes to improve healthcare. So P matches with 2. Loss of access can be transitioned into restoration of community assets and services. So Q matches with 3. And social disarticulation, which is a negative impact of resettlement, can be transitioned to networks and community rebuilding activities, which can be undertaken at the resettlement site. So R matches with 1. So the option B, that is P matches with 2, Q matches with 3, and R matches with 1 is the correct answer. Okay. So moving on to the next question. State true or false. According to the cultural keynote species, Garibaldi and Turner of 2004, culturally salient species that shape in a major way the cultural identity of a people. Their importance is reflected in the fundamental roles these species play in diet, material medicine, and spiritual practices. So, is this statement correct? That is the cultural keystone species definition, which is being defined. Okay, so we have an answer A. So okay, we have discussed this previously in a previous question as well. So the statement is true. Okay, moving on to the next question. So, which among the following below defines the eminent domain? So, we looked up at this terminology in the land acquisition and the settlement module, the eminent domain. So, you need to look up at the terms carefully. There's with and without. There's also the use case, that is private use or public use. Okay, so we have one answer, which is B so far. Okay, so B is so eminent domain is the right of a government or its agent to expropriate private property for public use, but they have to do that with payment of compensation. So again, key terms here are the use, that is public or private use, or with or without payment. So the government can acquire private property for public use, but they still have to pay the compensation for it. So C is the correct answer. Okay, so again, read the options carefully, especially if they are just with the changing of one or two words. Okay, moving on to the next question. Match the terms given in Group A with their description in Group B. So we have terms relating to land acquisition and resettlement, and in Group B we have their descriptions or definitions. So you need to match Group A with Group B. We have covered a few of these definitions in a previous question as well. Okay, so the correct answer is D. That is, resettlement is the planned process of relocating people and communities from one place to another. So P matches with 4. Then economic displacement is the loss of income streams or means of livelihood resulting from land acquisition or obstructed access to resources, land, whatever forest, resulting from construction or operation of a project or its associated facilities. So loss of economic income. Q matches with 1. Then compensation is any payment in cash or in kind for an asset or a resource that is acquired or affected because of the development of a project. So R matches with 2. And then host population is people living in or around areas to which people who are being physically displaced by a project will be resettled there, and which may in fact be affected by the resettlement. So S matches with 3. So the correct answer is D. That is, P matches with 4, Q matches with 1, R matches with 2, and S matches with 3. Okay. So moving on, what are the key objectives of the IFC Performance Standard 2, which is on labor? So first is compliance with relevant employment and labor laws. Second, safe and healthy working conditions. 3, fair treatment and non-discrimination. And 4, worker protection, especially vulnerable groups such as children. Okay, so we have one answer D, that is all of the above. Okay, so D is the correct answer. That is all of the objectives mentioned in the options are the key objectives of the International Finance Corporation second performance standard on labor. So D, all of the above is the correct answer. Okay, moving on. So you need to match the IFC performance standards given in Group A with their description in Group B. So different standards and what area or category do they deal with? We have discussed all of these in all of in this week's content. All of these performance standards have come up at different stages. 3 of them relate to the socioeconomic impact assessment, and one relates to a different topic. So the correct answer is D, that is the performance standard 2 deals with labor, which we looked up at in the last question as well. Performance standard 3 deals with resource efficiency. Performance standard 6 deals with biodiversity, conservation, and natural resources. And performance standard 7 deals with indigenous people. So performance standard 2, 6, and 2, 3, and 7, they deal with the socioeconomic impact assessment, while performance standard 6 deals with biodiversity. So there's no correct option, I think, which has been mentioned. So the correct order is that P matches with 3, Q matches with 2, R matches with 4, and S matches with 1. So the options have been, I think, correctly mentioned. Okay, moving on to the next question. So match the IFC. Okay, I think I've not changed the question subtext, but match group A with group B. So in group A, we have different terminologies relating to transport related AIA, and in group B, we have the definitions. Okay. Okay, so I think this is also a question which can have multiple options. So I think I will just move forward with this question. The options are kind of slightly twisted. Moving on to week for assignment. So since the deadline for week for assignment has passed, we can now discuss the assignment questions with their solutions. So this will just be very quickly, we will review the assignment questions. Okay. So which of the following institutions deal with water management? This is a multi-select question. More than one options can be correct. So Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, MOHUA or MOHUA, Ministry of Jal Shakti, and the CPHEU. Okay, I'm pretty sure you would have answered these questions. This is just like a revision. So this is a multi-select question. More than one answers can be correct. Okay, so the correct answer is A, all of these above. So all of these institute deal with water management. So whether in terms of policy, programs, or guidelines, all of these institutions, they deal with water management. So this is the slide from which this question has arisen. So you need to also read about and remember which agencies deal with what environmental parameter, especially from the Indian perspective, Indian agencies and organizations, which institutions play a role in what activity or what environmental parameter. So A, B, C, and D, all four are the correct answers. Okay, so moving on to the next question, state true or false. The standard IS 10500 2012 in India provides permissible and desirable limits for various parameters of drinking water. Is the statement true or false? Okay, we have an answer A. Okay, so A is the correct answer. The IS standard 10500, which was passed in 2012, it gives you the different permissible and desirable limits for the various parameters relating to drinking water. It is the Indian standard for drinking water specialization, and it gives you characteristics like color, pH, taste, turbidity, total dissolved solids, and what are the limits, what are the permissible limits, and what method is being used. So the statement which was given is correct. So A is the correct answer. Moving on to the next question. Match the SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals, which are mentioned in Group A with their respective themes in Group B. Okay, we have one answer. We have another answer. Okay, so the correct answer is SDG 2, which deals with zero hunger. So P matches with 1, which is end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. Sustainable Development Goal 12 deals with responsible consumption and production. So Q matches with 3, which is ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Sustainable Development Goal 15, it deals with life on land. So it matches with option 2, which is protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. So option C, that is P matches with 1, Q matches with 2, Q matches with 3, and R matches with 2 is the correct answer. Okay. So moving on to the next question. State true or false. The Bonn Convention of 1979 deals with the conservation of migratory species of wild animals, and the purpose of EIA is to protect threatened animals to maintain viable migration routes that migrate across seas and or national boundaries. So is this statement true? So it basically highlights the key intention or mentions the key intentions of the Bonn Convention of 1979. Okay, so we have one answer, A, which is true. Okay, so A is the correct answer. The Bonn Convention of 1979 is also known as the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, and it deals with the use of EIA to protect threatened animals to maintain their viable migration routes, such that they can migrate across seas and our national boundaries. So, and this so the statement is true, and in India, the convention came into force in 1983. Okay. So moving on to the next question. Another state true or false. The UNESCO World Heritage Convention of 1972. This convention targets to protect the national and cultural areas and these areas of outstanding value as World Heritage sites. So is the statement true or false? Okay, we have another answer, A. So A is the correct answer. That is the UNESCO World Heritage Convention of 1972. It protects the natural and cultural areas of outstanding values, such as the World Heritage Site and sites which are of biodiversity importance. So the statement is true, and it came into force in 1975, but India ratified this convention in 1977. Okay. So moving on to the next question. The CRS or Coastal Regulation Zone notification under the Environment Protection Act is created to ensure livelihood security for the fishing communities and other local communities living in the coastal area. So is this statement true or false? Okay, so we have one answer A, that is true. So the statement is in fact true. That is the intention of having coastal regulation zones is such that to ensure livelihoods, security for the fishing communities, and also for the local communities who are living in the coastal areas. But it is also to conserve and protect the coastal areas or coastal stretches and to promote development in a very sustainable manner based on the different levels of risks and scientific based on scientific knowledge on risks and natural hazards which can happen in these different regulation zones. Okay, so the statement is true, but there are two other purposes for doing the coastal regulation zoning or having coastal regulation zones. Okay, so moving on to next question. The Biological Diversity Act of 2002 contains a provision that aims at preservation of the biological diversity in India and establishes a mechanism for equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the use of traditional biological resources and knowledge. So is the statement true or false? Okay, so this statement, we have one answer which is A. So the statement is also true. That is the intention of the Biological Diversity Act, which is also known as the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, and it has two aspects to it. First is the conservation of biodiversity, the preservation and conservation of biological diversity, and the second is the equitable sharing of knowledge and resources. So the statement covers both of these aspects. So the statement is true. Moving on to the next question. So again, a state true or false. World Health Organization WHO gives noise guidelines based on health parameters for specific environments. Is this statement true or false? Okay. So we have an answer A, that is true. So the statement is true. The environmental noise guidelines, as given by WHO, has recommendations for different types of noise for different environments like road traffic, railway noise, aircraft, wind turbine, leisure noise, interim targets. So all of these have been mentioned in the WHO. So the statement is true. Okay, moving on to the next question. State true or false within the Environmental Protection Act of 1986 and the Environmental Protection Rules of 1986, Section 6 of the Act empowers the government to make rules to regulate environmental pollution. So, is this statement true or false? Okay, so we have one more answer, which is A. Okay, another A. So this statement is in fact true. Under Section 6 of the Environmental Protection Act EPA of India, 1986, Environmental Protection Rules of 1986, the government had made rules for the regulation of environmental pollution. And so the Central Pollution Control Board, CPCB, and the State Pollution Control Board, SPCB, both of them looks at or are entitled with ensuring that these environmental pollution guidelines and this act is being enforced. So the statement is true. Moving on to the last question for week 10, week 4 assignment. So match the themes given in group A with their description in group B. So these are all terms which were discussed in week 4. Okay, we have one answer which is C. Okay, we have another answer. Okay. So C is in fact the correct answer. So the gross ecosystem product or the GEP is the total value of final ecosystem goods and services supplied to human well-being in a region annually. And it can be measured in terms of biophysical value and monetary values. So P matches with 3. Then access and benefit sharing or ABS is a system in which genetic resources may be accessed and benefits resulting from their use is shared by users with countries that provide them. So this is the one of the aspects of the Convention on Biological Diversity CBD, which is the access and benefit sharing. So Q matches with 1. And then the payment for ecosystem services PES programs. These are market-based approaches used to incentivize the conservation-related activities. So R matches with 2. So the correct answer is C. That is P matches with 3, Q matches with 1, and R matches with 2. Okay, so this was all which was covered in the assignments. Uh, if you have any queries, you can either unmute yourself and ask, or you can put them in the chat box. Uh, we did not receive any queries from you in the discussion for them relating to this week's content. So if you have any queries, you can just unmute yourself or put it in the chat box. Okay, so if there are no further queries, I would like to close this session. Thank you so much for attending this session, and I hope this was beneficial for you in some ways. And if you have any feedback regarding the course or these problem solving sessions, there are feedback forms which are also, I believe, being circulated relating to this course and other courses if you're taking them. So please give your feedback in them as well. And if you have any other feedback, you can give it directly as well. If there's nothing, then thank you so much for attending this course, problem solving session for this course. And I will now maybe close this session.